Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to Loving the Scriptures, welcome. And I hope that that what you find in this episode will be beneficial and profitable for you spiritually. We are back. I've been away for a couple of weeks, for a couple of episodes before the new year, and even after the new year. And if you're listening faithfully, you'll know that the last couple of weeks I featured sermons from my Attributes of God series, which we've been going through whenever we take a break from a regular study that we're doing right now in the book of John. The first sermon that we featured during this break on the mercy of God, I believe, was planned. And the original plan after that was for me to come back and to continue on in our study of John and start with John chapter 9. But if you've been listening, you're aware that that didn't happen, and that the week after that, I put on another sermon from that series, this time on the self-sufficiency of God. And the reason why that is because there were some things that came up that kind of made things kind of hard for me to put everything together and finding a good time to record and everything like that. And I didn't want to rush and put things together in a haphazard sort of way and bring something to you guys that really wasn't as quality, I think, as, some of the other things that I present on this podcast. So, just some church things, sad church things. Unfortunately, I had to prepare for doing a funeral and everything, and then preaching alongside of that. Plus, I was having some health issues as well. Came down with a cold, so it was health issues as well. I might kind of sound still a little bit congested, but that's kind of way on the tail end of everything I had been feeling at least from last week. So I'm feeling okay. I'm feeling better now. I cough every once in a while and that sort of thing, but for the most part, I feel okay. So all of those things brought together, and you have a situation where it's like, it's probably a good idea, maybe to delay coming back on the podcast for another episode to make sure I get everything else figured out and done and accomplished, so I can come back with you guys to open up John chapter 9 in a proper way, which is what we're going to do on this episode. And so in John chapter 9, we're looking at the account of Jesus opening the eyes of the blind man. There was a man who was born blind, and Jesus opens his eyes. Now, while we're dealing with a physical miracle in all of this, and the investigation that follows, that's conducted by the Jews, Jesus' Jewish religious enemies who are unbelieving, they investigate this miracle that's happened, and wondering, how this guy physically received his sight back. There is that physical aspect of things that's amazing, but there's a spiritual element to this as well. And Jesus kind of lays it out at the very tail end of chapter 9, which we're not going to get to that part in this episode. But again, just so you know, while we look at the physical aspects of these things, there's a spiritual element to this as well. Again, the spiritual element connecting to the things that happen physically, kind of connecting the dots to kind of make a spiritual and theological point. Jesus is good at this. We've seen him do this on a few occasions here in the book of John, and he's going to do it again once we come to the end of chapter 9. So when it comes to the whole thing of Jesus opening up the eyes of the blind, let's keep in mind that we're going to be considering things from both a physical and a spiritual perspective as well. We're going to see a lot having to do with the physical elements of this, but you're going to get some spiritual aspects of this as well. And we're going to get a little bit of a refreshment here, because the man who's born blind, after everything that Jesus does for him in him receiving his sight, what you see as the text goes forward is somebody who has a positive outlook on Jesus, and it's not hard to know why, but I mean, like, it goes a little bit deeper than that. And his attitude towards Jesus and how he understands what's happened to him, and therefore who Jesus Christ is in stark contrast to the Jesus' Jewish enemies that he's dealing with in this chapter, and the Jesus' Jewish enemies, the same Jewish enemies that we've been dealing with for a long time, it feels like, both in chapter 7 and chapter 8. I mean, they've been making their appearances even before then, but as far as, immediate proximity to where we are right now, getting out of chapter 7 and 8, where it just seems like what we see predominantly is unbelief. And we'll see unbelief here in chapter 9, and we'll see the lengths that these unbelieving Jews will go through to kind of deny what has happened. But even in the midst of that, now you have somebody who has a developing faith that we're seeing as the text goes forward, and it's really refreshing to see, again, after everything that we've been seeing up to this point. So we'll talk about all those things and just kind of pick this passage apart. Let me go ahead, as per usual, and read the passage in question here. We're going to be looking at John chapter 9 verses 1 through 23, and let me read what it says here. And it says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of God, the works of him who sent me, while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and he said to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, Is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, It is he. Others said, No, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, Then how were your eyes opened? He answered, The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, Where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought him to the Pharisees. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. So the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But the other said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? He said, He is a prophet. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, Is this your son whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. His parents, as I turn the page here, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, He is of age. Ask him. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, well, before we get into the text and work our way through this again and just kind of pick this apart, let me go ahead and present to you the normal preliminaries at the beginning of every episode, and that is to let you know that if you enjoy loving the scriptures and you haven't done so already, I would strongly encourage you to follow and subscribe to my show wherever you listen to this podcast. Also, be sure to follow me on X. The handle is at LTScripts, that's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Living the Scriptures. Haven't been as active on there lately. It's not like I'm super active on there anyway, but from time to time I'm somewhat fairly kind of medium active, but haven't been lately, but I'm planning on picking that up and just kind of tweeting some verses and words of encouragement and things like that. So go ahead and follow me on X. And also, please don't forget, if you haven't done so already, to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It. It's a book about Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse. So Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, as Jesus answers the disciples' questions about the end of the age, is when will these things be and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so in Jesus' answer, how are we to make heads and tails of these things? And so that's what we do in that book. I strongly and highly recommend it, obviously. But go ahead and order yourself a copy. As usual, I'll leave links in the episode description. So click on it, it'll take you to an order page. One is for Amazon.com, another is for BarnesandNoble.com. But if you want to try and see if it's available in another avenue, feel free to do that as well. But whatever the case, I hope that you order it. I hope you read it, and I hope that you are blessed by it. Okay, so we've got a lot of ground to cover, but let's see what we can do as far as covering this in a reasonable amount of time here. I just want to remind you of the immediate setting that we have as we're getting into this chapter of John chapter 9. Remember, immediately where we're just coming out of. In chapter 7 and chapter 8, remember the context has been Jesus in Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles, or as again another interchangeable term to use on that is the Feast of Booths. And Jesus has been teaching in the temple, and he's been getting quite a bit of pushback from Jews who do not believe. And it gets to a point, as we saw in chapter 8, where we're talking about whose father is who, and that sort of thing. The Jews are claiming that they are children of Abraham. Jesus is saying, no, if you were children of Abraham, you would believe. Essentially, is what he was saying. And they would even be ones who say that God is our father. And Jesus is one who says, actually, you are of your father, the devil. So you have all these things. And that's just a really, really pared down summary. There's a lot that we went through and that we covered. Going through chapter 7 and chapter 8 has taken probably a significant number of weeks. But again, those are lengthy chapters anyway, so it would take a while naturally. But what we have here, what we looked at last time when we were in John, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago. We have this climax here in this encounter that Jesus has with these Jews in the temple. They're ones who are questioning Jesus, essentially questioning his whole thing of saying that, life only comes through him. They're saying that you're crazy because, Abraham died, and so did the prophets and everything like that. And so how can you be saying the things that you're saying if these great stellar men, that's just kind of the idea behind, some of the things what they're saying, they're thinking and saying, how can what you'd be saying is true when such stellar men are known to have died, especially, somebody like Abraham. Jesus was one, and I'll just go ahead and read here. Let's see, in verse 57. Let me go back to verse 54, just so we get a little bit of the ending context, so that once we start going into chapter 9, we have, just kind of the backdrop of what we have going on here. And so in verse 54, it says, Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And so there you get, you see this clear declaration of deity, because that's the covenant name of Yahweh. So Jesus is claiming to be God himself, who has perfect authority even over people like them. And as we see in verse 58, they didn't take well to that. It said they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So that's where we left things. We left things with the Jews, who were taking active steps to try and kill Jesus right there by picking up stones to stone him. All throughout chapter 7, and I believe in other parts of chapter 8, if I remember correctly. I'd have to look back. But I mean, especially I know for sure in chapter 7, we saw a few areas where narratively John lays out the fact that there were people, after hearing what Jesus would say, that would want to kill him or arrest him. And the whole idea of arresting is like taking him into custody that would lead to his death. And you can use those two terms interchangeably. But the idea was they wanted to do away with Jesus, but it wouldn't happen because, as Scripture says there, his time had not yet come. His time will come, but it wasn't at that moment. And so here we see an instance where, after Jesus lays something out, and this is something that's a pretty powerful punch, regarding who Jesus Christ says that he himself is, you have these Jews who pick up stones and they try and stone him, and Jesus slips away. So there is a murder attempt by these Jews during the Feast of Tabernacles to do away with Jesus, and it comes to no avail. So once we get into chapter 9 here, and then it starts talking about, as he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth. I mean, keep in mind that once you read into chapter 9, we're dealing with Jesus on his way, and this is immediately following Jesus' escape from the Jews who wanted to kill him. There isn't anything in the text to give us this idea that a significant amount of time passed. So I mean, if we're saying so they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, and as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. So right at the end of chapter 8 and into chapter 9, it's like we're still dealing with a continuous sort of thing. Now, in chapter 9 itself, everything that I read to you near to the beginning of this episode, and reading the first 23 verses of this chapter, that all doesn't take place in one day. But where we are right now, at the beginning of chapter 9, we are still dealing with the same day, the same setting as when Jesus ran away from the temple, as people were trying to kill him. So here he's passing by, and he comes upon a man blind from birth. And so, he takes time. So remember, people are just trying to kill him. I don't know if people were in hot pursuit of still in hot pursuit or something like that, but you gotta imagine, there's kind of, maybe hurried footsteps or something like that, or maybe not. I mean, if his time had not yet come, maybe it didn't matter. But whatever the case, Jesus escapes though, and he's, as it says there at the end of chapter 8, he hid himself from them. So there's an active movement away from where the danger was, and so in that escape, he takes time to stop for this, what I would consider to be a divine appointment with this blind man. And this blind man possibly that they pass by is possibly something you passing him by while he's begging. It doesn't say anything about him begging now, but if you saw in later on in the passage, you see that he was also a beggar, which makes sense. I mean, if you were blind back in that day, your choices as far as earning a living was very limited. You can't do a lot of things when you're blind. And I mean, actually, the same thing is true today. But I mean, there are certain other options that maybe you can put in place in today's time, in today's era, that might help blind people out to do something with their lives. Some people might just be on constant disability or whatever like that. But for other people, they try and pursue other options. Here in the first century, you don't have those options. And so if you're not able to work, you're not able to make a living for yourself, and it's very easy to live a very poor life in poverty, and so you're reduced to just begging. And so you see the same thing with the lame beggar in Acts chapter 3. Same thing. If you're paralyzed and you're not able to walk, your options as far as how to make a life for yourself and to earn a living is very limited. And so people of that sort were left to begging. And you see the lame beggar begging at the temple. And so it's no surprise here that this blind man, who's later identified as somebody who was a beggar, it makes sense. Now, where he was begging, if he was begging at the temple or somewhere else, we don't know. The text doesn't say. Wouldn't be surprised if he was begging at the temple. I mean, so if this was at the temple, and this might have been just outside of the gates or something as Jesus is leaving, or maybe a little bit further down the way on the road that leads up to the temple or something like that. Again, all of that is speculation. We don't ultimately know for sure, but I mean, there he is begging. And so, I see this as a divine appointment. I mean, kind of along the same lines as what we saw Jesus doing with the Samaritan woman, where the scripture says that he had to go through Samaria. And I believe that he had to go through Samaria to have this encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. Same thing here, just based on what Jesus would say the purpose was, God's purpose in this man's life, and explaining why this man was born blind, and we'll get to that here in a couple of minutes here. But nevertheless, they come to this man who was blind from birth, and in verse 2 it says, "And his disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" Now, to us in the 21st century, that might be a little bit of a weird question. It might even actually be somewhat of a rude and somewhat politically incorrect question to ask. I mean, just from a religious and spiritual point of view. But you have to realize, and you have to keep in mind that in Jewish culture, that wouldn't have been a weird question to ask at all. The Jews had a belief that tragic things that happened to people was a result of the sin of that victim, or of the individual who's suffering whatever pain or whatever disability that they have. Case in point, and this actually shows you how long this belief had existed. Case in point of this would be Job. And if you're familiar with Scripture, you're very familiar with Job, and how he was how first of all he lost his property and his children and all in one day, and then later on he actually is stricken with these painful sores from head to toe, in the next moment. And everything, and when Job's friends come and visit him, what are they suggesting to Job as he's lying there? Is it saying that that God is still with you, and we're here to comfort you and give you words of encouragement and that sort of thing? No. They might have thought that they were helping out, but really they were suggesting that everything that Job is going through, it has to be because there's some sort of sin or sins or whatever the case may be that is under your belt that you need to confess before God and get right with Him, because if not, this is just going to continue, and this is the result of the sin, whatever it is that's going on in your life. Now, God has brought correction in a physical sense to people in the Bible, and I think that that's not outside of his realm of possibility even today. But it's not an automatic thing where if somebody's going through some sort of trouble, whether it be sickness or disability or something like that, that it's because this person, whoever he or she is, must have sinned. 9 times out of 10, you see it's very, very inappropriate to come to that conclusion that, okay, this person is wheelchair bound because he must have sinned in some way, or that person who got in a car accident and died, the reason why that happened is because of his sin, so forth and so on. We are not in a position to make that determination. Sometimes those things happen, and it isn't a result of some sort of sin that they're dealing with, or that sort of thing. So, but I mean, in the Jewish world, in the Jewish culture, and again, it would have to be, things that are on a somewhat serious scale, and this would be one where you're dealing with somebody who's not able to see. His blindness is permanent, and it's been, from the very beginning. He's been born blind. Things along those lines. There's speculation from people within the culture, maybe not even speculation, but certainty that somebody is going through this because of a certain sin, or sins in their life. So in this case, asking about the parents, the parent sin is kind of a natural thing, because remember the disciples said, who is it that sinned? Is it that this man sinned, or his parents, that he was born blind? Who sinned, this man or his parents? And notice that isn't, that those are the only two options that are on the disciples' minds. And just in the minds of the disciples, just like any other contemporary Jew, those are really the only two options to explain something like this. There wasn't any other third option, and Jesus is going to provide a third option that, I would guess to say that a lot of people at that time really didn't think of as a possibility, and we'll get to that here in a second. But again, like I said, asking about the parent sin is natural, but how could the blind man have sinned if he was born blind? That's a little bit weirder to consider. To ask if this man's parents sinned, that this man was born blind, is a question that kind of makes sense. But to also say, did this man sin that resulted in him being born blind? Well, you might say, well, how does that work? If he was born blind, that means, are you saying that there's a possibility that the baby sinned before he was born, and while he was still in his mother's womb? Are you suggesting that is something that's a possibility? Yes, that's what many people. I don't know if everybody believed this, but there were a good number of people who believed in prenatal sins. So there was also this belief in prenatal sins in the womb, that might possibly be connected to the whole faulty understanding of generational curses and that sort of thing. So if you have, sins from previous generations, and there's a generational curse, you might have things like this that would happen, and so the sin is very much connected to the baby in the womb. At the same time, though, that it's still dealing with somebody else's sin and not the sin of the baby. But there is all this to say, though, that there is, or there was, a belief among many Jews that would say that a baby could be born, could sin within the womb. What exactly that looks like and how they conceived that, or of what that would look like, I'm not entirely sure, but that was a belief. And so again, culturally in that time, for the disciples to ask about a man born blind, if he sinned in order for, to cause this whole blindness to take place, wouldn't have been an unusual thing to ask as well. So their question is, was it this man himself or his parents that he was born blind? And so Jesus, in verse 3, it says, Jesus answered, "It is not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." So basically what you're dealing with this is that Jesus is about to unleash and unfold here a healing that is going to be on display to the glory of God. Okay? To the glory of God. And is that, just to throw out a quick question here, is that how we see certain things even in our day and age as it relates to certain debilitating things, or whether we're talking about physical handicaps or some other hardships that we go through? A lot of times maybe our natural inclination is to think God is somehow against me, God is punishing me, that sort of thing. Could it be that some of the things that we go through, or even as it relates to certain handicaps, and I'm not gonna delve into any sort of deep speculation because I don't think that's really my place, but we do know that God is able to glorify himself through what he does through people who are disabled and have been disabled. Even with somebody like Moses, we're not talking about paralysis or any sort of, debilitating sort of thing, but even as it relates to his speech, his inability to communicate properly, I think the suggestion that he perhaps was laying forth in there when he was trying to dissuade God from sending him to Egypt to talk to Pharaoh to tell him to let the people go, was kind of suggesting that he had a speech impediment, and God essentially says, "I know, I made it that way." But you see, that's kind of the point. God can use somebody like Moses even when he has trouble speaking, and might have that disability of speaking, to be able to accomplish his purposes, and God is thus that much more glorified. Now here with the blind man, we're going to see something totally out of this world, where again, as we saw, you have a man who was blind and then he's able to see. But again, basically what we're dealing with here is a healing to the glory of God. So Jesus says that neither the man or his parents sinned, but the reason for his blindness was so that the work of God, and again, the work of God would be the healing of the blind man, that the work of God might be displayed in him. That's the whole idea. That's the whole reason behind this, and that's why I alluded to this before as a divine appointment. This is a divine appointment because it's now come time for this display to take place. So this man was being prepared for this moment, for when Jesus, the God-man, was on earth and was crossing his path, that this, we could say, I would really say, a preordained appointment, this meeting as they're passing by. This isn't just happenstance. This is part of the divine calendar, the divine agenda for God's work to be displayed among the people. And so listen to what Jesus goes on to say as we continue in verse 4. He says, "We must work the works of him who sent me, who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Now, let me just explain really quickly what I think is going on here, what we're dealing with here, as Jesus is saying these words. As he says there, he says, "We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day." Now, he mentions day there, and then he goes on to mention night, as I just read there a second ago. And I think it's the proper way to see this is that day equals the time that Jesus is on the earth. Remember, as he said there in verse 5, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Okay, so this is the day that we're talking about here is the time that Jesus is on earth, humanly and bodily, during that in the time of that first Advent. Okay, now note that when he talks about this, notice he says we must work the works of him who sent me. And I think that in that context, in that immediate context, what he's talking about is the disciples. And so Jesus and the disciples are ones who are working while it is still day. While it's not laid out in John, keep in mind that in the synoptics we read about Jesus sending out the disciples 2 by 2 to different regions in Israel, announcing the kingdom and how they had been given authority to heal the sick and drive out demons and that sort of thing. That sort of activity by the disciples as they were sent 2 by 2, I think would fit in that category, as Jesus is saying we must do the works of him who sent us while it is still day. And so the disciples were ones who were active participants in something like that. So I think that's the we is very important, is very interesting there and very important. And I think the way to understand that is that he's talking about the disciples. Now, also note here is that the works of him, it says that they must do the works of him who sent him. Remember, as it says there, we must work the works of him who sent me, right? So this points out all the more that all this that's being done here, this is God's work, and this is part of the divine agenda that we're seeing here, just as I mentioned before, and that's all the point. That's the point, and all of this is just to point to Jesus being the Christ, the Son of God. Okay, so hopefully you see how all these things are working together. Now, I mentioned how there's day. He mentions day, and then he mentions night as well. In that verse, where he says, "Night is coming when no one can work." And so I believe that when he's talking about night and saying that night is coming, I believe he's talking about the time after Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension. So essentially, after Jesus' time on earth, after that whole thing is completed and he's ascended. It's saying that night is coming. Now, note on this here, where he says, night is coming when no one can work. Now, what I don't believe that he's talking about here, I don't think this doesn't mean when he's saying that no one can work, this isn't Jesus's way of saying that that Christ can no longer be revealed to the world. But I think rather what's being said there is that the display of the work of God through Jesus Christ will not be manifest later as it is right now in that present time when Jesus is ministering on earth. Doesn't mean that God has stopped working, doesn't mean that Christ has stopped working, doesn't mean anything of that sort, doesn't mean, as I said, that Christ will no longer be revealed and that sort of thing. But again, it's the manner in how all of these things are fleshed out and revealed to the people that Jesus was ministering to in first century Palestine. Okay, and so that's what he's talking about, I believe, when he says no one can work. And really, I mean, in a certain sense, maybe you can extend that time to the time of the apostles. Seeing what they did, the same kind of works that Jesus did during his earthly ministry. You see them doing that in the book of Acts and everything. But there comes a specific time when that is no more. And so that sort of manifestation, as you see during the earthly work of Jesus, is no longer something that is displayed to the people around him. Okay. So I think that that's what you're dealing with there. Now, those that are living, I mean, in the days of Christ, in Jesus's day, if all of what I'm saying there is true, then really what you have here is a very blessed advantage for the people who are living in the days of Jesus, who are there and who are able to witness some of the things that he did in their midst. We've already seen in places like chapter 2 and whatnot while he's at the Passover feast, while he performed signs and people believed in his name, kind of in a shallow sense. And again, chapter 3 makes that apparent. But I mean, just imagine people had the opportunity and the advantage of being able to see the work of God at work through the Son, Jesus Christ. Now, the question is, would people believe? And when I say believe, I'm saying, would people believe savingly? Because we've seen and we've studied what false belief looks like. We've seen it more times than we would like to in this gospel thus far. But I mean, as it relates to the works of God through Jesus Christ, would people believe? Some would, and we see this in the case of the blind man here, but you have other people who wouldn't. Now, as it comes to verse 5, Jesus says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Okay? And so I think what he's saying there, as he's saying, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. In other words, given the urgency of working while it is day, because Jesus isn't going to be there shining this light forever, as it relates to his earthly ministry, given the urgency that there isn't a time when he isn't shining that light. It's always shining. He's always shining with the purpose of displaying the works of God through him. And thus also the works that point to the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And remember, even as John is laying these things out in the book of John, that's the reason why he's writing this down, so that his original audience who's reading this, that they would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. It all comes back to that purpose there as it relates to this written down gospel itself. Okay, so again, so this isn't Jesus saying that as long as I am in the world, I'm the light of the world, and them in saying that when I'm out of the world, I'm no longer the light of the world. What he's saying is that as long as I'm in the world, I'm going to continue to shine the light as I've always been doing, because there's going to come a time when day ends and night comes. And so there's an urgency as far as there's no time to waste. You get a sense that, Jesus will continue to be, the light of the world, just based on what you read. And we've gone through this before in chapter 8, verse 12, where he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me, that is, follows continuously, will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. That's something that applies to followers of Christ, and that applies just as much to people who are followers of Christ after Christ's time on earth as it is before his time, before and during Jesus's earthly ministry there. So I think it's important to point that out. Okay, so that's what we have there as far as those opening words, and we've come this far in this episode, and we've only gotten through the first few verses, but we'll see how much more that we can lay out here. But as we continue on, so Jesus says that in verse 5, and then as we go into verse 6, it says, having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Okay, so now this whole thing with the mud, and making the mud out of the saliva, it says that he made mud and then he anointed his eyes. And, another way of looking at it, I think based on the Greek word, is that, he kind of smeared it on his eyes, kind of along the same lines as anointing. Now, I don't completely know why Jesus did things this way. Not completely. I have an idea, maybe, but it's just an idea. It's not a cold hard me saying this is why Jesus did it this way. I think a lot of people are just as confused, and people have their own guesses. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of people really don't know 100% why Jesus made mud and put it on the man's eyes as part of the process of healing this man of his blindness. I don't know completely, but here's my idea of why Jesus perhaps maybe did it this way. Right now, since the blind man is instructed to wash, right, because he anointed his eyes and then he told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, there is now an opportunity for the man's faith to be demonstrated by his obedience, which we could say is in contrast to the behavior of Jesus's enemies, right? Jesus's enemies is all you have is disobedience there, and just coming from their hearts and from their lives. But even with something as simple as going and washing in the pool of Siloam, you have something where there's an act of obedience that can be displayed now. And now we have a contrast between, somebody who is of faith or is developing faith versus people who are hard-hearted and will do everything in their power to deny what Jesus Christ is doing and is what Jesus Christ is doing in their midst. And so there you have this opportunity of obedience to be demonstrated. Now note, his instructions are very specific. His instructions to wash are specific. He didn't say, no, go wash your eyes or just go and wash, but he said, wash in the pool of Siloam. So he probably could have washed anywhere, and perhaps maybe somewhere closer by than the pool of Siloam. Again, I'm not entirely sure about that. That's just speculation. But he probably could have washed anywhere. But the fact that he followed through on Jesus' specific instructions really displays his faith. And perhaps we would even say the faith of the people who led him there. You would kind of assume that the man had to have people around there to lead him there. Jesus didn't lead him to the pool of Siloam. And it was very unlikely that he went there alone. And how else would he get there without the help of other people? But again, you have this display of faith by his actions of doing and following through with what he says. Now, he was told to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which John describes means sent. And so this washing in a pool, this is a washing in a pool that demonstrates the workings of someone who was sent to do the work of God. All right, that being Jesus Christ. So I think that there's some sort of, that's why John lays that out there, saying, hey, by the way, the meaning of the word Siloam means sent, and so there you're supposed to make those connect those dots there based on the meaning of the name of the pool, Siloam. So as the text says, he went there and washed, and he came back and he was seeing. All right. And again, so there's no, just like many of the other miracles that we see in the book of John, there wasn't any fanfare, no fireworks or anything like that. It's something that's very matter of fact, but it's not, that doesn't make it less spectacular. This is somebody who was born blind. It still would be amazing if he had lost his sight sometime in the middle of his life. But this is somebody who hasn't seen at all. His eyes have never worked. And so to take somebody in that state who's never seen before, and through the works and the power of God, being able to give him sight for the first time is pretty spectacular. Now, here's the whole thing is because now we're dealing with something where something, people are recognizing the spectacular nature of everything here. And as you go further here into things here, you start to have people, as it relates to just the people starting to recognize who this man is. In verse 8, it says, the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. So that was verses 8 through 12. And so this is what we have here. We have, two groups of people that are identified here, the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar. I think with neighbors, we're just dealing with those who are closely acquainted with him. And then the other ones who are, there were more observers, of the man, and, they'd seen him, begging before, and, but they weren't necessarily personally acquainted with him or something like that. But however way you look at this, you have people who are now beginning to see that, something is up here. There's this man who used to sit here begging, and now he's going around and he has his sight back. Now, notice here, it says, in verse 8, the question, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Used to sit. So, and this would seem to indicate here that some time has passed. How much time, we're not entirely sure. But enough time where the man no longer begged anymore, because he didn't have to after receiving his sight. And so his absence is noticeable, right? His absence is noticeable. And, so after a while they see him walking around and he's not begging anymore. And so they're able to say used to, this was the man who used to sit, and beg. Okay. But again, how much time passed, I don't know. It could be like a handful of days or something like that. And that's why I said what we read here in chapter 9, and even in the verses that we didn't get to, the rest of chapter 9 that we didn't get to probably happens in one day. But I think you have a series of days where this investigation is going on. This all isn't happening, in one day. As we see here, there's a disagreement, as we just read there, over the identity of the man. Some, were saying that it is him, and then others says that no, it's somebody like him. But notice he was one who kept insisting, that he says, no, I am the man. It is me. So he kept insisting on his identity, and so that led to the natural question, which I would say comes from natural curiosity. How were your eyes opened, right? And again, just to go back to how the blind man answered the question, in verse 11, he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go wash in Siloam." Notice he said the man called Jesus. And I think that this may indicate that he was speaking of Jesus in a manner that would suggest that that Jesus as a person was already familiar to everybody else in the Jerusalem area, and that by no means is any surprise. You see the apparentness of his fame in chapter 7 and chapter 8. You see him growing in popularity in chapter 2. And even when you look at the synoptics, we see that Jesus was gaining a name for himself. So that's not surprising. So the man saying, the man called Jesus, it was him. He's the one who did it. And he explained the process through which all of this took place. And so naturally, they asked the question, where is he? Perhaps out of positive curiosity, perhaps. Some people might think that it was, they were wanting to find out where he was so that they can do him in because of the fact that he did this on the Sabbath. But there was no indication that necessarily that the man had pointed out that he had been healed on the Sabbath. He was just asked, how did this man open your, what happened that your eyes were open, and that sort of thing. I think if anything, the revelation of this happening on the Sabbath was made known during the investigation that the Pharisees were doing. But nonetheless, they ask, where is he? And he answers, I don't know where he is. So again, and this is kind of a thing back in John chapter 5 when Jesus healed the paralytic. He had healed him, and then he'd kind of gone away. Jesus did, and hid himself in the crowd. He just kind of does his healing and then just kind of goes away. In the same way, except Jesus didn't go away and hide himself. Well, he did hide himself because people were after him. But, this was a situation where he told the man to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, and there was that separation there. And so from there, the blind man doesn't know where Jesus went. And so here we are in verse 13, where this man is brought before the Pharisees. Verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus had made mud and opened his eyes. And I think maybe perhaps that is in connection to him being brought to the Pharisees. Again, some people say that the reason why they were brought to the Pharisees was that it was done on the Sabbath. But I mean, if the Pharisees are ones who are investigating what happened, because their whole thing is how were your eyes opened, and they're probing and they're asking questions, which is an indication of what you see when you read this text. When you read further into the text, there's likely to be the discovery that this is something that happened on the Sabbath. And so that's going to be something that triggers the Pharisees and the rest of the Jewish enemies in saying and dismissing what has happened and dismissing the witness testimony and everything like that of the identity of this man, and saying that, they focus not on the miracle, but on the fact that Jesus is one who does not keep the Sabbath. So it says there that they brought the man to the Pharisees. And I would be one who would say that this may be because they were wanting to bring some sort of positive case about Jesus to the authorities. So maybe these are possible allies of Jesus. And the reason why I say that is because, some of the pushback that you get from some of the people as the Pharisees are investigating this. We'll see this here in a minute. But, I want to be careful with my use of the word positive, just kind of the whole thing that I say as far as a positive case about Jesus. Because when I say that, I'm not necessarily saying that these people came forward and presented this man and saying this Jesus guy is really the real deal, and look what he did to this man, and so you have to believe in him now. Because they know and they understand the Pharisees and people who are closely attached to them, their animosity that they have towards Jesus. So when I say I'm making a positive case, I don't think that they're making an overt positive case and saying you have to believe now because of this. I would imagine that they're a little bit cautious because of the threat that the Jews had and was laid out to people, and saying that, anybody who confesses that Jesus is the Christ will be unsynagogued, right? But I mean, at the very least, bringing Jesus to their into their presence, maybe under the guise of saying, hey, can you maybe look into this, and maybe see what's going on here? What sort of answers can you give to something like this? Because something very spectacular certainly has happened. That's possibly what you're dealing with there. And so I would say it's not a foregone conclusion to, at least kind of think of the possibility that these people who brought the blind man or the formerly blind man to the Pharisees were allies of Jesus, or people who were started to have sort of positive thoughts about Jesus. But instead, the Pharisees find a reason to accuse Jesus, and they don't focus on the miracle, right? John points out that the miracle was done on the Sabbath, and like I said, that's kind of the trigger that you have going on there. So once you have this whole thing, all this information about the Sabbath that's laid forth, you see in verse it says again in verse 14, it says, "No, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes." Verse 15, so the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. Notice they asked him again how he received his sight. So the man must have given the answer more than once. How many other times, I don't know, but there may have been multiple times. And the reason for that may either be because they were still not satisfied with the testimony of the miracle. That's a possibility. Or another possibility is that they were searching for more concrete details to better condemn Jesus with. Now, what it could be either one of those. Which one it is out of the two, I don't know. Maybe there's other possibilities as well. But again, the sense that you get is that they're continuing to hound him with the same questions as far as getting down to the bottom of what happens. And it says, so the Pharisees asked him again how he had received his sight, and he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I wash, and I see." Some of the Pharisees, in verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." So again, there's that connection there. But then you have others who said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" Right? So there you have, two differing opinions on this whole thing. The Pharisees, so again, we have a division of perspective here. Now, notice it said some Pharisees were saying this, and they were saying that because this was done on the Sabbath, Jesus cannot be from God. Now, forget the miracle, right? Never mind that there is a miracle that happened with a man who was born blind, and now somebody who, as his parents would point out, is of age, now sees. That's not even on the Pharisees' radar. That's not something that's on their radar. They're not worried about the miracle. They forget about the miracle because he did something good on a sacred day. And because of that, in their mind, his origin of being sent from God is denied, right? That's the depths of what you see as far as it relates to unbelief. And then, as we said there, others said, "How can a sinner do such signs?" And this is the obvious question in light of what the Pharisees are presenting here. That's the obvious question, right? But the Pharisees' hearts were so hard that they could not see the obvious, right? The others who were kind of pushing back on that were thinking, and again, I don't think they were presenting this in an overt objection, because again, a lot of these people had to be careful. But it was just a question of, if this man is a sinner because he broke the Sabbath, then how did he have the ability to do this sort of thing? Because if he was a sinner and a rebellious person against the one true God, and was very flippant on the law of God and that sort of thing, it's very unlikely that you would see the power of God working through him to do such an awesome miracle like this. And so what resulted was, as the text there is there in the middle of the verse, a division, and there was a division among them. All right, and that's, by the way, that's not the first time that we see division. There was division, just like you see in chapter 7, verse 43. The people were divided about Jesus there. So as a result of this, again, as you in verse 17, so they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? Okay. And I believe that there's a intention behind this here. Notice the text says, so they said again, and that's laid forth in light of the fact that there was division among them. So I think that this is perhaps is an attempt to shift the people's opinion, especially the people's whose opinion might be gravitating towards this whole thing of there's something to this Jesus person, based on what we see that he did to this blind man. And so because there's division, those people were saying that, and the Pharisees were saying this man can't be from God because he breaks the Sabbath. You therefore have them switching things a little bit, and they they want to focus on what the healed man might say and what he has to say. Maybe with the hopes of him saying something that would be disagreeable to everybody in the audience or whatever, and then that being enough to disengage people from any positive thought about Jesus or something. Again, that's speculation as well, but I think it's just interesting that, because of the division, they say, so they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him, since he opened your eyes? So again, we're not talking again about asking about how your eyes were open. They've been asking that again and again. This isn't the last time, though. That question will come up again later in our next text that we're going to look at next time. But for now, what we see is a different question. And instead of asking how your eyes were open, they ask him about his perspective on Jesus. And his answer there in verse 17, the end of verse 17, it says he said he is a prophet. Now that answer alone says a lot when you compare it to how other people have been responding to Jesus in a very negative way. Now, Jesus is a prophet, but we know that he's much more than a prophet. But I mean, what we see here is that that this man's response and how he sees Jesus, he's on the right track. He's definitely on the right track. And what we're going to see is we're going to see a development of the faith of this man who had been formerly blind but now sees. And again, keep that in mind, going from blindness to sight, and how we're going to start making connections here to the spiritual, because spiritually we talk about blindness and sight and that sort of thing. And that's what Jesus is going to bring up. So not only are we going to have this situation with this man who was physically blind but now sees, but we're seeing now, this process of faith where this man who spiritually was blind is now seeing things as they really are. And that also, by the way, is a divine work of God. Okay. So that's what you're dealing with there. But as it relates to these other people, and here in verse 19, the Jews, and that's probably still along the same lines as the Pharisees. Remember, the Jews, whenever it's laid out like that in the book of John, it's usually talking about Jesus' enemies. And many of those times it's, connected to the Jewish religious leaders and that sort of thing, which is what we're dealing with in this passage in the people of the Pharisees. Verse 18. I think I may have said 19. If I said 19, I meant 18. Verse 18, the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight. So there you see the persistence of their unbelief. They didn't believe that he was born blind and received his sight. Now, whether they thought that he was lying, they must have thought he was lying or something, or was trying to pull a fast one on people. And maybe ones were saying that he was one who pretended to be blind and then pretended to receive his sight. So maybe this is a ploy, maybe in connection with you. I mean, whatever the case may be, they were ones who at one point were still continuing to not believe that this was an actual miracle that happened. And so here you see, even after all of the evidence in front of them in the testimony that's laid before him, they refuse to believe. And this is the depths of unbelief that we see that's just so tragic and so devastating. And this is important to understand because you see this same sort of thing in many people today. A lot of people think that if we get enough evidence, scientific evidence and scientific data in front of people who deny the existence of Jesus and that sort of thing, and we speak science and that sort of thing, that we can convince them of the reality of God and then work our way towards them believing in Jesus Christ. Now, God can use those things. I'm not saying that it's wrong to speak about the things of God from a scientific perspective, from a apologetic perspective, and that sort of thing. Those things are incredibly valuable, and God uses those things through certain people who are educated in those areas. Okay, so those things are fine. But it's just as true where you can present all of the most convincing facts and present the most convincing data in front of people, and they still will not believe. Because ultimately what you're dealing with is a heart issue. It's not like an intellectual issue. Some people say, I just need more evidence, more evidence, more evidence. You can throw all the evidence out there and they still won't believe. And again, why is that? Because you're dealing with a heart issue. So here you're dealing with people who are of hard heart, and it's showing, right? These were people, again, as it says there, the Jews did not believe he had been blind and had received his sight until, so again, they're going to hear, maybe from the parents, and they might be convinced that he was born blind, had received sight or something like that, or something had happened, but it's not going to be something that leads to true saving faith. Okay, so in other words, they're going to be convinced that this person wasn't faking it. He wasn't pretending or anything like that. This wasn't a certain ploy. They may have thought that before, but until they, as it says there, I lost my place. Okay, here, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked him, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. Now, this is a very interesting situation here that we're dealing with here, because it's like, so it's natural. They call the parents, and this isn't something where the parents are just around the corner. This is probably take some time to summon them and bring them. So that's why I'm saying there's probably more days that pass in the course of this investigation. But the parents are brought before these Pharisees, and they essentially ask three questions. Number one, is this your son, whom you say is born blind? I kind of think that that's a second question, but in very many ways connected to that first. So, is this your son, who was born blind? And then number three, how does he see? I mean, basically that's what you have. Now, the parents answer the first two questions because those are the safest questions to answer without getting in trouble. Yes, this is our son. Yes, we are aware that he was born blind. I mean, there's no harm in that. But the third question, the answer to the third question, they defer the third question. They claim ignorance on the how and the who. But how he received his sight and who it is that opened his eyes, we don't know. We have no clue, which in all likelihood is a lie, based on what you see parenthetically there, what we see parenthetically at the very end of our passage here, in which we'll bring this to a close. In verse 22, where it says, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue, right? So those were the consequences. Now, the threat of, they feared so the parents feared the threat of the Jews there. And to be unsynagogued, in other words, to be thrown out of the synagogue, to be kicked out of the synagogue, to be disassociated from the synagogue. I mean, we have to be careful about how we think of these things, because we think about, how somebody might be disfellowshipped from a church or something, and then you just go to another church and nothing really happens with them as far as their social relationships within the city, within the community, and that sort of thing. It's bad, but it's not that big of a deal. In the Jewish culture, to be unsynagogued had very high social and cultural implications there. It was not an easy thing. If you were unsynagogued, you were pretty much shunned in Jewish society. So this was a big deal, and people didn't want to lose that social aspect of their culture. That was something that was very important to them. And so with that threat looming, they knew that was a serious consequence if anybody claimed that Jesus was the Christ. Now, here's the thing: with these parents, they could have easily they could still answer the third question in a truthful way without claiming that, hey, Jesus is the Christ. Because if they know how he got his sight back and who it is that gave it to him, they could just express that as fact. And it would probably be along the same lines as what the formerly blind man had been saying all along. So their testimony would match, and it really wouldn't do anything. So I think what we see here is the depths of the fear that these parents had of being disfellowship from the synagogue by being kicked out of there, and playing it as safe as possible. There are ones who are saying, to be safe, we're just gonna plead ignorance on this, and we're not gonna say anything that will come close to getting us in trouble, where there might be some sort of misunderstanding where we are, where we're somehow associated with this Jesus person, and that we're in favor of him and that sort of thing. And so we'll just say that, how this happened and who did this to him, we don't know. And so they just pass it off to the son. He'll speak for himself. He's of age. He's able to speak for himself. And as we're going to see when we continue with the text next time, he certainly does speak for himself. Unlike his parents, who are kind of afraid of this whole thing, we see a person who's gradually gets bolder with these highly educated, high status Pharisees who are locked in their hard-heartedness, so much to the point that their hard-heartedness becomes so evident that some simple person like a regular no-name blind man who now sees is able to connect the dots. And you actually see him start to get a little smart alecky with the Pharisees, which I think is very amusing. So I can't wait to talk about that when we get there. But all that to say is that there's more to this story as we're going to try and finish off chapter 9 next time. And we'll actually finish a lengthy chapter in 2 episodes, it looks like. So that's kind of the plan going into this. But again, remember what we're working towards. We've talked a lot about the physical, in the physical eyes of the blind and everything like that. But now, the connections are going to be made and are actually still being made evident right now, just as it relates to the different responses to this whole thing, about how we look at things spiritually and what spiritual blindness looks like and what spiritual sight looks like. Spiritual sight that is resulted coming out of spiritual blindness, and that also being a work of God. And we'll talk about that next time as well. So we will leave it there for now, to be continued, because again, we're in the middle of the story here. But hopefully you have an idea of just how strict of a thing unbelief can be, and how that sort of thing is still in existence today. And many people express certain things like that. I've talked to people who have that kind of attitude, and it's really a sad thing when you see people grasping at straws sometimes. But it's just an expression of their unbelief. You have some people who can think logically and scientifically. I mean, it's not necessarily logical. Any sort of thing that you can call logic that denies God really isn't, I would say, along the logic category. But I mean, even with people who tend to think in good ways, they use their brain in the right way, come to the wrong conclusions. You have some people who are like that, but then you have other people who will say some of the most wild things. And the sad thing is that they don't even see that the things that they say are just kind of like, what in the world are you talking about? How is that the conclusion that you've come to in order to say what you say as far as the non-existence of God and that sort of thing? I'm just thinking things. I'm not saying word for word things I've had with conversations with people or anything. But again, that's just an expression of hardness of heart, an unbelief that will go out of its way to deny God and the things of God. And when you see something like that, it should be all the more apparent that when it comes to somebody who is in that state, but then becomes a believer, that is ultimately a miraculous work of God, where you're dealing with somebody. I've used the term hard-heartedness, but really to use the terms of what we're using in John chapter 9, blindness, you have somebody who's blind and then is able to see. And then you see the true miracle of what you're dealing with and what God is able to do in a particular person's heart and in his life, okay? And, that's, I think, what we're seeing with the man who had been blind, physically blind, and now physically sees. Unfortunately, we don't see the same thing with the Pharisees. So you see two sorts of things that are put side by side, and we see belief and unbelief put side by side, and you can see the stark contrast there. But anyway, we'll leave it there for now. Again, if you enjoyed this program and you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow me on X. The handle is at LTScripts. It's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And then also order a copy of my book, Signs of the End, What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return, and the events that point to it. Links in the episode description. All right, friends. Well, I had a great time as normal going through Scripture with all of you. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.